Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really delighted to welcome so many of you to our first MRC Public Involvement in Practice webinar. And this is the first one that we've run of these, but we're really hoping that this will become something that we can do twice a year. So if you've got ideas for future webinar sessions at the end of this, then we'll be asking you for those. So my name is Rachel Knowles. I am the lead for clinical research, policy ethics and governance at the MRC, or the Medical Research Council, and that's part of UK Research and Innovation. And Heather Briggs is also here today from the MRC, and she'll be helping me and supporting me to actually lead this seminar. This is, as I say, the first webinar that we've run, and we decided we wanted to run this and also to invite the three speakers to come along today because of the work that we've been doing at the MRC that they've actually been contributing to. So over the past year at the Medical Research Council, we've been working to integrate and strengthen public involvement across all of the MRC funded research. And MRC funds research across the whole of the spectrum, from clinical research to non-clinical research. So we fund things such as cell and tissue-based research, preclinical research, basic science research, data science, so a whole range of things. And you can imagine that although public involvement is quite well developed in the context of clinical research, actually for non-clinical research, it's much less well developed. And that's a big part of the research that MRC funds. We felt that it's very important for MRC to be able to demonstrate transparency and increase trust in the research we fund. And we feel that public involvement is one way in which we can do that. So about a year ago, we actually commissioned a group called Vocal, who are a not-for-profit organisation from Manchester, who have a long history of experience and expertise in the area of public involvement. And we commissioned them to do a landscape mapping review for us. So to look at what MRC and MRC researchers do already and what we could do in future. We asked them to explore public involvement practice within MRC and also within the wider research community so we could understand about best practice. And we particularly asked them to have a specific focus on non-clinical health and biomedical research, because that's such an important part of what we fund. And so they did quite a number of things, including interviews, workshops. They set up an external advisory group, and they brought back to us some of their findings. So they identified for us a whole range of case studies which demonstrated really how successful public involvement could be in the non-clinical context. So that for us was very heartening. It demonstrated to us that it is possible. They also had some key recommendations for us. And one was that we should think about moving away from traditional concepts of public involvement as a practice that supports the research life cycle and is focused on individual research questions or projects, and try to think more about public involvement as being central, as underpinning the research environment and threaded all the way through it, and therefore applicable to all types of research. They also suggested that we should really be thinking about the purpose for which we want to do public involvement, and that all of our public involvement should be purpose-led. It may need to be quite bespoke to the different contexts in which we're finding ourselves. So, for example, in some situations, it would be perfectly reasonable to involve patients who have experience of a particular health condition, whereas in others, we should actually be thinking about just involving members of the public who perhaps have life experience that is actually very relevant for them to bring along. So, for this particular webinar today, we've invited along three people who have contributed in some way to that landscape mapping review. And we felt that we really wanted to hear more about their experiences of public involvement and to actually share that. So we've got, first of all, Dr. Emma Dorris, who is a programme manager at the PPI Ignite Network and from University College Dublin. And she actually was sat on the external advisory panel which supported Vocal during the time they were doing the landscape mapping review. So we're very grateful to her for that. And she'll talk about public involvement in lab-based research from her perspective. There's our second speaker. We have Professor Hal Drakesmith, who comes from the MRC Human Immunology Unit, and that's at the University of Oxford. And again, Hal sat on one of the workshops that Vocal ran and also contributed to the case studies. And then finally, we have Dr. Tamsyn Derrick, who is a program manager at MRC head office and who has recently set up a young people's panel to actually help her in a funding call for adolescent health. And she also contributed to one of the internal workshops that Vocal ran. Each of these speakers are going to talk for about 15 minutes, and we're then going to have a panel session where we have a Q&A for around 30 minutes. So if you want to put any questions that you have into the Q&A as they're speaking as we go along, then we'll pick those up. And you can also upvote using the Q&A to actually, if you have particular questions, you can see there that you're interested that are answered. And then finally, if you do want to actually speak during the Q&A and actually put up your hand and talk, we'll also have that facility. So you don't just have to put your questions in the Q&A. Okay, so I'd like to start now by handing over to Emma Dorris. I have asked all of the speakers if they would just say a little bit about themselves and introduce themselves, because I'm sure they'll do it much better than I could, and to actually just say a bit about why they're interested in public involvement and got into this area. So Emma, if you'd like to share your slides, and then we'd be really interested to hear from you.
Great. So I'll introduce myself as I'm getting my slides shared. So I'm Emma Dorris. I currently work in University College Dublin, where I work in the research office. I have a remit there for what we in Ireland called engaged research. And as part of that remit, I'm program manager for the Public and Patient Involvement Network called PPI Ignite at UCD. So my background is I have a PhD in molecular medicine. I was a biomedical researcher in academic lab research for about 10 years post-PhD. I then went on to do a Master's of Public Policy, specializing in science and research policy. And I did that master's specifically because of the interest that grew from public involvement in research. And that interest grew through my own work and my own experience as a lab-based researcher trying to embed it. So I'm going to focus today on my personal experience as a researcher and how I worked towards public and patient involvement in biomedical research. In my day-to-day work now, I suppose I focus more on the systems and the enabling environment that allows other researchers to do it, but a lot of this is based on my own experience as well. So I'm going to take my phone out so I can start my timer to make sure I don't go over, and go ahead and start. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to mention was how I came into public involvement, and I'll probably switch between saying public involvement and PPI, but essentially what I'm talking about is involving the people impacted by the research in the research process. My route to PPI was through open science. So this is how I first came in as a biologist, a molecular biologist, working on lab-based research. About 12, 13 years ago, open science was a very big thing. And through my interest in open science and open research and democratization of research, that's where I suppose the formal process of engagement of patients or people with societal knowledge first came to fore. So it's the first time that I'd kind of heard about it as part of the research process. And I'll be very honest, it made absolute sense to me. So it just seemed the same way as I would work with clinical people in the clinical space, because I didn't have knowledge of the clinical one. It made absolute sense for me to work with people who had a different type of knowledge that I didn't have. I could immediately see how it could potentially benefit my thinking, and through benefiting my thinking, it could then impact my research. So that was kind of perhaps a more slightly unusual route into it. And I was in science, and I still love science because I love the process of it. So I know a lot of other people go into science and go into laboratory science to help people, and that was a great thing that would happen. But my primary motivation was actually the scientific process itself. That's what I was really excited about on a day-to-day. So working with people who had this lived experience and could give me more context really helped me to motivate and stay on track in my research. It's kind of, it's always tempting to fall down certain scientific rabbit holes, but having somebody asking about where the impact was going to be was incredibly helpful. So I'm going to just discuss a little bit about the very, very start of how we started with what's called the Patient Voice in Arthritis Research, which is a community of people with lived experience that I suppose built up from scratch. So it's important to note that the Irish landscape is very different from the UK landscape. So we're a much smaller population. We've 5 million people. And although we do have health charities that fund research, not very many of them then, and even now there's not a huge amount, had large PPI contributor networks. So unlike places in the UK where some of the larger charities have really well educated, maintained and accessible places for you to go and reach people who are affected by the condition or the disease you're studying, we didn't have that type of network really in the Irish population, and a lot of that is purely due to size. So we really had to kind of work from scratch. So the very first question is, if we are going to be asking people to give up their time to help us with research, why would they want to do that? Was my first question as a researcher. So I spent about 6 months speaking with various different people. So researchers from different disciplines who'd done similar before, people with lived experience who'd done it. Arthritis Research UK, or what is now Versus Arthritis, very kindly had me over for one of their trainings. And what was very clear is that there was not a correct way to do this. There isn't a protocol for PPI, it's an approach. So it's a change of behavior. So what we decided to do was to think about what was possible from our point of view as researchers. So I was part of a research center. So we didn't have a dedicated person or resources for this, but what might be possible? So we came up with some ideas, and then we put a call out to invite people in to help us create the strategy. At the time, it was just something that made sense to me. I didn't realize it's what now would be called co-design, but it was just seemed to make sense. I have an idea of what might work for us. Do you think this might also work for you? And what we did was we had about 16 people with different types of lived experience, particularly in the area of rheumatic diseases, who came together in a neutral space, and I hired a journalist to come in and report on what was said. And that was because I didn't want to bias it by what I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear what was actually said. So from that, we started out as kind of that very rich meeting. And then we started to work on what the feedback from that one meeting was and grow as and when we could as a community together. So if you notice, I haven't mentioned research at all yet, because we're still in the relationship building part of this, which led to rich public and patient involvement downstream. So this is the report that came out of that workshop and that work that had gone in beforehand. This report was reviewed by every member who had been there to make sure it actually reflected what was said on the day as well. The important thing is that we started then acting on some of the small low-hanging fruit, and even some of that wasn't low-hanging, but we started to act on some of the things that people had said that they wanted from us to make them more comfortable to then interact with us in a more, in a deeper way. So that was things like they wanted us to be more open about what we were actually doing, who we were. So we simply did this newsletter that was a committee with both people with lived experience and researchers on it that would just take different pieces around research, explain what they were. but also have pieces from the patient community and explain what they were. So you were getting this view from both sides. We also used Newsroom as nearly a stealth way to introduce people together. So we had people with lived experience come in and interview certain researchers. And this would usually be very senior researchers. And what this would do would be, it would help the researchers understand what questions were important to the people with lived experience, because they were the ones asking them. Would it also, when the person then went and wrote it up, showed the researcher what they thought they said, was it the same as what was actually heard by the person writing up? And actually out of these kind of what seemed like simple interviews, a lot of very fruitful then relationships would grow, because now you have that touch point, you have a senior researcher who now has a relationship with a person with lived experience that is not a doctor-patient relationship. So what a lot of these things did was, it was all part of building trust, building respect, and learning how to work with each other. So people, it was the back and forth and the learning how both categories of people, I mean, we're all just people, both, you know, the researchers and the people with lived experience, how we could work together. And because we had this kind of building and these small aspects where we clearly showed respect, we were listening to what people said, we valued their contribution, this began to allow us to have more in-depth types of engagement, because both us as researchers, and I believe from what our PPI contributors said, felt more confidence in having those relationships together. So before we go on to some of the examples of some areas and how it impacted the research, I just want to list that these relationships and these collaborations that we had throughout the research process were enabled by certain things that were also happening at the same time. So within our research center, for example, we changed the governance structure so that 1/3 of the governance, the boards, the steering committee, were now actually people with lived experience. We opened up the spaces around our research. So what we mean by that, it's not necessarily the physical spaces, but any research event, research seminar, Zoom seminar, anything like that was now no longer just restricted to clinical or academic audiences. They were opened. I mean, we were running them anyway, so why would we keep that space closed if there were more than just clinical and academic partners in research now? And we also had a lot of co-learning, so back and forth, bringing in a lot of our PPI contributors. I mean, they are more than just their disease, you know, they have lots of other experience and values, and we recognize that, and a lot of them came in to actually train us in various different aspects that were part of their day job as well, and vice versa. Some wanted training in research, so we were reflective to that and responsive to that, and created some specialized training for them as well. So there was this back and forth kind of learning aspect. And as we kind of wrote about our experiences, we always we tended to write not just from an academic point of view, but these are just two examples from papers where we were writing about our experience of it, and we always included both perspectives. Okay, before I go now into the exact examples of how we involved, what I want to really emphasize is that when we're talking about public involvement in research, it's public involvement in research, and research is not the same thing as your methodology. So research goes right from your idea through all the different stages of a research cycle, pre-award, award, post-award. The bit that's highlighted here, that little box, that's where your research activities, your methodology, your data collection happens. So even in a scenario like lab-based research, where there may not be space directly within the methodology for involvement, there's still a huge amount of scope. Decisions around research are not only made in methodology, they're made right through the research process. And those decisions can be really fruitfully influenced through greater perspectives. So in this example, I'm going to talk about a project which the paper was called A Novel Relay Truncating Mutation in a Familial Behçet's Disease-like Mucocutaneous Ulcerative Condition. Clearly, when we did our lay summaries, it was not named that. So just to kind of outline the science aspect of what this study was, we used patient-derived blood samples. We used donor blood samples. We used cell lines and human cell lines, and we used mouse cell lines. What we were doing was like knocking down genes, overexpressing genes, looking at what impact that had, essentially. So things that classically would not lend themselves to public and patient involvement. But of course, what have I explained to you there? Not the research, the methods that we used. So the PPI that we had in this process was a pre-award. So as we were developing the idea for this, we had discussions with Arthritis Ireland, which is the national charity for arthritis, around their views on what we had planned to do and how relevant they thought it was in the Irish situation. They then supported us in the grant as well. Through the patient voice in arthritis research, we put a call out, and we had about 10 different people who actually reviewed different versions of the lay summary. We came back and incorporated them. And one of the really fruitful aspects was in the pre-award phase. We just had conversations with 3 or 4 people around, so what actually are the potential impacts of the research? Not what we usually think about, which was the clinical and scientific impacts, but actually what were the potential impacts of the research beyond that? So we kind of brought in this particular we're working on can affect young people. So some of the potential impacts around young people and missing school and et cetera were brought in there, which we wouldn't have thought of otherwise. In the post-award phase of the research, we had a PPI contributor on the interview panel. So they helped in shortlisting the applicants and was also on the interview panel itself. This was incredibly beneficial. There were some really technically sound candidates for this role, but having that person who had a similar lived experience ask questions really demonstrated to us who wanted a job and who wanted this specific job. It really helped show who'd read beyond to actually understand the context, the impact of the research. And it was so clear cut after that, some of those questions, who the right person for this particular position was. We had our postdoc who was hired to this position, who's Neve, who's in the picture in the corner there after she won a medal for her clarity in research, explaining her research project to the public. She was mentored throughout the project by a PPI contributor, so a person with a lived experience of vasculitis. This really helped with her thinking, and it really helped with her communications of it. And it also helped then at the quarterly meetings that we would have had, we would have included all members of the research team, including our PPI contributors. So in terms of impact of this, it had demonstrated impact on the research, which I'm not going to get into now, but essentially we were having difficulties with one particular area. And through the probing and the questioning that happened in the conversations that we had with our PPI contributors, we were actually able to come up with solutions that I don't know if we would have gotten to otherwise. It certainly had a huge impact on the researcher, so on Neve herself, and she would, say that it greatly helped her to understand the importance of what she was doing, but also to understand the difference between key messages for the scientific, the clinical, and then the patient audience as well. And for us as a research centre, it really helped with our research culture. So what I mean is, for us as a research centre, it really consolidated our move towards this model, where we were more open and more collaborative with people with lived experience in it. So this is just one example of the research culture. We have in a response actually to the patient voice in arthritis research, we hold now a public conference which is on arthritis research but open to the public. So it's scientific presentations but in lay language. And we had our Minister for State for Disability there one of the years, and our welcoming committee was me as chair. We had the management of the university through Professor Orla Feely, who was the VP for Research, Dean of the school, and then one of Stephanie Skeffington there, who was a patient insight partner as well. And it was just a natural thing for us to have, well, that covers all parts of us as a research team. In terms of, Stephanie isn't here today, so I don't want to speak for her, but she was one of the key patient insight partners on this. So in terms of impact for her, she actually wrote up an abstract for one of the conferences about her experience, and she's continued on doing various different work within both rheumatology and on other areas as well. So I don't think we've time now to go through a couple of other examples, but they are there and I can go into them at a later stage if there are questions. But in terms of key messages that I just want to leave you with, the first thing is that it's really important as a preclinical or lab-based research to realize that there is a difference between your methodology and your research. Day to day, we've spent so much time thinking about our methods. That's where your head is. Take a step back, look at the entire research process and look at the decisions we make around research. They are all areas where it is ripe for different perspectives outside the scholarly perspective. And PPI adds context. Successful PPI relationships are really enabled by an openness. So an openness to not knowing it all and to being open to being questioned and having healthy debate and being transparent in what you're doing is really important. And same with reciprocity. In other words, should be of benefit for both parties. So this should be a dialogue that you have, a proper working relationship that you have with somebody who has different knowledge to you. And of course, respect. And it is important to note that this is sustained by an enabling support system. Sometimes that's out of the hands of the researcher, but that will greatly help. So a supportive academic culture is really important for that. And I think that's it. My time is up. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emma. That was really, really interesting. I'm sure there'll be lots of great questions when we come to the Q&A. I particularly liked your example of actually getting the public contributors to interview the researchers. I think it's a lovely way of sort of turning things on its head and really getting people to engage in proper discussions. So really interesting. Thank you very much for telling us and opening us to the potential of public involvement in non-clinical research. So I'd like to now introduce Hal Drakesmith, or I'll let Hal certainly introduce himself, but if you would like to share your slides as well. So as I say, Hal comes from the University of Oxford and actually contributed to some of the workshops that for our landscape mapping review. Hal, please do start.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the invitation. That was a great talk. I'll probably not be as detailed or as Emma was there. That was really inspiring. So yeah, I'm a kind of a jobbing researcher based at the MRC supported Weatherall Institute of Molecular Medicine, where we have two MRC units, the Human Immunology Unit, which I'm a part of, and also a hematology unit that we work very closely with. But I've also been the co-chair of what we call PERC, PERC of the job, Public Engagement with Research Committee, for about a decade now, and so overseen quite a few of the institute's public engagement and developing into public involvement activities. So I'm going to give a bit of background and then move on to the specific bits about public involvement. Okay, so yeah, so to go back 5 years, to the sort of the beginning of the dreaded QQR that we went through, we decided we had to have a proper strategy of public engagement and communications. These were 3 aims. So we're almost contractually obliged to describe yourself as a world leader, but hopefully we are in our field. We wanted to make public engagement really a core part of the unit's activity, and to build up lots of different labs' ability to really engage with that process, and to make the research conducted by the MRC Human Immunology Unit accessible to non-academic stakeholders. This is kind of, although it's great, it's a bit generic, and perhaps others on the line from other MRC units are kind of seeing that they could almost swap the words and it would be pretty similar. And one thing that is noted is that the word involvement isn't mentioned at all at this point. We hadn't really thought about the difference between engagement and involvement, and reciprocity versus just kind of one way. And this is where we'll be going with this in this talk. Okay, but we have done a lot of engagement, and just as a brief background, we've done all sorts of different stuff as a unit and as an institute. Festivals, we've made an online game that can be played freely about vaccines. We've hosted work experience, sixth formers. We've done a kind of a comedy thing that probably wasn't that funny, but it was all right. Lots and lots of schools outreach activities from lots of different labs, and lots of different training, both training of researchers as to how to do public engagement, and sort of trying to get PIs to understand that this was a useful and interesting thing to do anyway. And then in more detail, there's a whole load of stuff there that we did. I'm not going to go through it, but basically there's one bit here where I was invited to join the public involvement in non-clinical research, which I found really quite eye-opening and very interesting to think about all of our public engagement activities from a rather different, more global involvement type perspective. So this is what I'll be talking about, how we're thinking about moving from engagement, which, although it shouldn't be, often seems to be scientists going out and finding the public and talking, to them, hopefully not at them, and with them, and really trying to make sure that this really is much more bidirectional. So the talk will be in 3 parts. Why do this? From a researcher PI perspective, particularly, what's the buy-in? And then our experience as an institute of what we did in a public involvement activity. And then going on from that, what are the considerations to really develop and grow this activity and this idea and way of doing things? Okay, so why do it? It was touched on a little bit briefly, but I think there are 2 main reasons. Really important one, I think, is this notion of trust. And I think there's a bit more to this than perhaps is obvious. So we know that, for example, the pandemic has made it very clear that public trust in science is very, very important, but it's also insecure and prone to effects of disinformation and so on. And one hopes that involving the public in even non-clinical research builds a bigger platform of trust that is overall useful for biomedical research. But I also think that trust needs to go the other way too. And as scientists, perhaps we need to have the experience of having more interactions with non-scientists so that we actually trust and value in the other direction. And I think this really does benefit a bigger perspective on different research questions. Very bespoke, as was said previously, and as I'll go into, but nevertheless, I think that there can be some clear benefits to researchers. Okay, the second reason is really kind of very well described in literature, is just getting a different viewpoint on any given scientific project, where inevitably I'm a prisoner to the literature to some extent in my field, and to what editors of scientific journals might want me to do, to grant-giving bodies who might want to see me publish papers in particular subjects. And it's quite good, really, to get different viewpoints on that, to stop your own opinions becoming too calcified. And this is always useful. And there is potential to refine a research question, even in a non-clinical level, to clarify thinking, perhaps, and clearly, as I'll come on to gain an extra level of enthusiasm and motivation, in fact, to do what you want to do. So what was our example? And it's quite a small example, but I think it was quite nicely done at public involvement in non-clinical biomedical research. And this was really the brainchild of a friend and colleague called Noemi Roy, who's a clinical hematologist, but with a strong research interest. And she also has a great deal of experience in traditional patient public involvement, where patients the Oxford Blood Group is a group of patients with hematological diseases and interact a lot with the hematological researchers who are doing the patient-facing research. So she's very much been involved in clinical research, public involvement. But this was this particular activity that I'll talk about was done in collaboration with another colleague called Tom Milne, and he's a non-clinician, and his lab is full of non-clinicians, and they work on epigenetics of cancer and cancer genomics, and don't have any clear, obvious patient-facing work that's direct. And so the idea was to try and figure out, although that Tom's work is on basic biological processes that underlie development of cancer, whether it would be useful, exciting, important to involve public in discussion of the research questions in his lab. So as a background to the actual activity, what was done and why we were doing it. So genomics research, which Tom's lab is involved in to some extent, including inherited and acquired conditions, so inherited anemias and cancers, is increasingly clinically relevant to patient groups. And in the UK, samples sent for whole genome sequencing are available for research as long as there is patient consent. But PPI projects that actually involve genomics are rare, and I think there's a perception that explaining the basic science that underlies things like epigenetics and genomics and variant calling and so on to a lay audience is a bit complex. Not sure that's true, but maybe there is a perception of that. So the aims of this study were to set up a series of workshops to help inform the patient groups to understand the basic research underlying Tom's lab and what they were doing, and to develop then a cohort that would then be able to contribute and provide that outside viewpoint on the research project planning that was going on in Tom's lab. And reciprocally, to then also develop the researchers in Tom's lab, their confidence and their ability to present these difficult concepts to patients and to the public, and to figure out what was perhaps the best way of doing that. So we had quite a lot of difficulty recruiting participants from the various PPI networks. About 3 different networks were consulted, both national ones and London ones, and then Oxford ones. But eventually we ended up with 6 participants from a patient group, and 3 presenters. I think there were 2 PhD students and a postdoc from Tom Milne's lab, and they interacted. So Noemi Roy, the consultant hematologist, gave the first general introductory session, and then there were 3 workshops all in a row, each with a basic science researcher talking to the hematology, the PPI network participants, and then a final session with the participants and presenters discussing what had been learned and giving feedback and so on. And both participants and the researchers were surveyed at the start and at the end for their experiences. I think the patient demographics is probably quite important to learn. So there are 6, half female, and of those 6, 4 had a blood cancer diagnosis, 1 an inherited anemia, and 1 no diagnosis. Everybody was over the age of 45. 2/3 had bachelor's degrees, and 1/3 had a master's degree. They'd all been involved in PPI before, but not PPI for non-clinical research. 1 had actually had their genome sequenced, and 3 of them, science was their highest qualification. So when we're saying public, this is clearly obviously not a relevant representative cross-section of the general public. It's quite a selected group, but nevertheless interesting. So, okay, results, participant impact, here we go. So if we go top left, as a result of the workshops, do you feel that you have now enough knowledge to contribute to discussions about genomics and epigenetics? Mixed response, but, some positivity there. If we go then top right, did it make a difference to you in your experience? I think, yes, half of them. Would you recommend it to somebody else? Yes, half of them. And then I think bottom left is really quite interesting. What were the overall motivations for wanting to do it in the first place? from the participants. So to help the hematology researchers to know more, general interest in science and medicine. 13% wanted better understanding that one person of their particular disease, and one person who is particularly interested in genomics researchers. But perhaps the single best bit of result was when participants were asked to give themselves ratings on their own knowledge as what they knew about genomics and epigenetics. Very low score, 2.33 out of 10 to begin with, but a very strong improvement by the end. So at least knowledge was transferred and hopefully some enthusiasm was gained. Then if we look at what the effect was on the presenters, again, only 3 here, so difficult to get, well, impossible to get any stats really. So why did they do it in the first place? I like that one that was persuaded by a colleague. I wonder what methods were used. One wanted to find out about whether they were any good at explaining, and one wanted to learn more about the public and patient involvement process. I think 2 of the 3 found it useful, and 2 of the 3 would recommend it to others. Did it actually make a difference to them and their work? And 1 out of the 3 did, which might be 1 more than one might expect, perhaps, but they found that it did, and I think that's interesting. So the summary of that really is that we thought that interventions that can allow patients and members of the public to gain a better understanding of genomics, this is particularly cancer genomics and cancer genetics, certainly are possible. The participants from PPI did feel that they learned things, which is great. The benefit to the presenters was perhaps not as clear, although I think, the fact that at least 2 of the 3 of them recommended that they would recommend to others to do it is evidence that this certainly can grow, and we are trying to grow it very much in the Institute. Okay, so then the final part of my talk is then just some brief thoughts about how we might go forward to develop this more, both in our Institute and in general. I think I had 3 considerations. The first is that there is a very wide spectrum of non-clinical biomedical research that is funded by UKRI, is funded by the MRC. So that ranges from evidently what we call translational, or a mouse model of a human disease, where you might think that it'd be relatively easy to have discussions with patient groups that had that disease, but then also very basic mechanisms into basic investigations into biological mechanisms. And I think that may be tougher and can be more distantly related to clinical issues. Definitely can be found very interesting and exciting, but perhaps not so relevant to patient groups as the participant, the public involvement. And so then the question arises, what sort of public involvement might you want to recruit? And then I think there's a debate to be had over what is the ease then and the utility of public involvement in those very different types of non-clinical biomedical research, and definitely bespoke approaches needed. And try and make each type of interaction mutually beneficial, that there is benefit from both parties. And I think there's absolutely no single answer to that. It depends very much on the individual type of research. I think it's really important to acknowledge that there's also a very wide spectrum of biomedical researchers. The people, in my institute are very different from each other. And they range, for example, people who are very keen to be involved in public engagement and public involvement, to people who are essentially disinterested. And what I find is intriguing is that does not seem to correlate with what they work on, whether they're doing something that is immediately translational or whether their career stage is PhD student or a PI. There's just a lot of variety. The characters are just very different. And I think it's not clear to me that it would be worthwhile to have a kind of a sense of universal requirement for individuals, certainly, maybe for labs even, to partake in public involvement exercises. But I think the opportunity to do so should really be presented and benefits outlined. I think we're in a stage of kind of learning and listening and figuring out what's the best way to do it. And then lastly, really importantly, there's massive variation in the time and resources available to actually do this. you know, we're lucky here in the Institute, we've had lovely support from the MRC for a long time, and lots of people who are keen to give up time to do these things in terms of our researchers. But we do know that from lab to lab, and even from unit to unit, there are very big differences in the culture of doing public engagement or public involvement, resources available, and the time that PIs are prepared to allocate to their lab members is really very different. And I think obviously the support structure has to be in place, and grant-giving bodies need to play an active role. And you know, I know head office are very keen on this, hopefully, to facilitate activity. So if the MRC, for example, want to see scientists partake in and expand development of public involvement in non-clinical research, then the resources have to be made available to do that. It has to be rated, it has to be an important component of evaluation, and so on. And I think that could be a really useful way of going about it. So just say thanks to Noemi and Tom for that particular example. And in our institute, we've had a series of absolutely fantastic public engagement professionals funded by the MRC. And it's Catherine Seed, Kat Vicenta, and Bryony Graham was the first one. And at departmental level, Charvi Narain has kind of overseen all of this. And I'd like to say thank you to Mary Derrick at the MRC, who's been hugely supportive of us over many years. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Hal. That's really wonderful and good of you to explain really a really thoughtful perspective on both the challenges and the opportunities of doing public involvement. And, you know, I think really useful to see how you actually tried to capture some of the impact of what you did, because I think that's one of the real challenges actually, is trying to actually understand, you know, how well we do when we do public involvement. So thanks very much, Hal. So I'd like to move on to our third speaker now, who is Dr. Tamsyn Derrick. And so Tamsyn, as I said, was program manager at the Medical Research Council, and she's been setting up a patient panel, or a young persons panel, in order to support a funding call around adolescent health. So Tamsyn, please do go ahead and share your slides.
Thank you. Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak today. So I'm Tamsyn Derrick. I'm a program manager at the MRC, and I work in the population health sciences team. So I work on a few large strategic projects, including one that I'll go on to speak more about, the adolescent health study, and a couple of others. And I also look after the public health intervention development funding scheme, otherwise known as PHIND. So as a bit of background to this talk and the public involvement that we're doing, so I talk about the adolescent health study, or the context. So yeah, MRC is setting up the adolescent health study, or AHS, and this will be a new longitudinal population study and data platform funded from 2024 to 2036 through the UKRI Infrastructure Fund, and the funding's for 62 million. So the aim of AHS is to stimulate an exponential increase in research to understand young people's health trajectories and outcomes, with a key focus on health equity. We aim to recruit 100,000 young people aged 8 to 18 at enrolment, and it will be a schools-based study. So during the scoping phase of AHS, and after discussion with quite a wide range of stakeholders, we identified a need for new tools and methods for working with young people in longitudinal population studies. And this is to make it fun and interesting for them to take part in the study, and to reduce the burden on participants who are taking part, whilst efficiently collecting useful and new information, so for example, data on social media use and so on. So the aim was to launch a funding call to support the development and evaluation of innovative tools and methods, so that the outputs will be ready to feed into the pilot stage of AHS, which will run from 2024 to 26. So co-production with young people is and will be crucial to the success of AHS. We don't bring in the perspectives of young people throughout its design and delivery, then ultimately the study won't appeal to them, and we won't achieve the recruitment and retention that we need to make the study successful and deliver on the promise of improving young people's health. So throughout the scoping phase, we've been consulting with existing YPAGs, or young person advisory groups. So these are established groups of young people that advise and get involved in research projects. And it's been really helpful to work with these groups, as they've got all the kind of necessary policies and processes in place for working with young people, and an understanding of what's required. But they can be quite busy, as they often work with lots of different researchers, and only do work on the weekends, so you have to book quite far in advance sometimes. So AHS is a large scale and a long-term study, and we want young person involvement throughout it. So we decided to set up our own group of young people that we could call upon now and then in future. So our first specific need was for a young person's panel to assess AHS methodological applications alongside an expert review panel. And this is so that the young person's panel could advise on the feasibility and acceptability of the research. So all young people want to engage with the project. Are the proposed methods appropriate and acceptable to young people aged 8 to 18? And then also on inclusion. So has the proposal carefully considered how to involve young people throughout the project? So there were lots of considerations when setting up our own group of young people, which we'll go into the next few slides. So firstly, on legal considerations, just as with adult panels, we reimbursed young person panel members for their time spent assessing applications. We used standard board and MRC board and panel reimbursement rate, and we paid a prorated fee calculated using timesheets to determine how much time was spent on our tasks. And the advice of the legal team was that this was likely to be considered as employment in a legal context. And children under the age of 18 of 14 were not allowed to be employed. So whilst we ideally wanted to have a panel across the age range of AHS, which was 8 to 18, we had to restrict this to 14 to 18 to comply with employment law. And then another point is that activities should not take place in school days if longer than 5 hours on a non-school day. So this is useful planning. So all of the activities we did took place on a Saturday. So then safeguarding is another consideration. So safeguarding is about ensuring the safety and welfare of young people that you're in contact with. So it's possible that during the course of the meeting, you may become concerned about the welfare or safety of a young person due to information they might disclose. And if this happens, you would need to you'd need to notify and refer this information to relevant contacts. So in the first instance, it's important to contact your local safeguarding lead and ensure that up-to-date referral and notification contacts are in place. And then to undertake safeguarding training so that you understand what you need to be aware of and how to respond if you have any concerns. It's also really important to let participants know in advance that there's a limit to our confidentiality about handling their personal information if there are concerns about their safety due to any disclosure that they may make during their involvement. So we have to make that clear to them as well. Then on DBS checks, so anyone working with young people requires disclosure and barring service certificate or DBS. So HR normally arrange this for employees for any work-related activities and can advise on whether basic or enhanced is needed. So we have basic level clearance for this, but it can take a few months to get the certificate back, so it's useful to plan ahead for this. Then on data protection, so age-appropriate privacy notices should be issued with the initial application form to explain how young people's personal data will be used and stored throughout their involvement. So we also conducted a data protection impact assessment, which is like a risk assessment. And then personal data should be stored in a single location on a secure server with restricted access, with storage duration in line with UKI's retention policy. So the lawful basis for collecting young people's personal data in our context was that it's a public task. So we did actually collect parent or guardian consent for young people to take part, and this provided an additional layer of protection. However, it wasn't legally required in this context, which surprised me. And then in special category data, for example, ethnicity, should be stored anonymously, not linked to applicant IDs, and cannot be used for decision-making purposes, such as shortlisting. And then obviously blind carbon copy everyone in emails so that you're not showing email addresses to each other. So most of these considerations would be the same for adults as well, but there's some additional layers of protection when it comes to young people. And then final considerations on confidentiality. So funding applications should obviously be treated as confidential information, but children don't have legal capacity to enter into a confidential disclosure agreement, which we would normally ask all panel members to sign or reviewers. So instead of this, the legal team advised that we use a document which explains the role and accessible language so that young person panel members understood and acknowledged that any information shared with them was highly confidential and that they agreed to take all necessary steps to ensure that confidentiality. So we also discussed this during during the introductory meeting and at the start of the panel meeting, just as reminders. So in terms of how we actually set up the young persons panel and recruited people, we created an advert and an application form and then disseminated it through networks of academics, listing young person group contacts and other organisations that work with young people. The application form included consent for MRC to recontact applicants regarding this specific opportunity, but also any future related opportunities, to request that we could contact their parent or guardian for consent if they were aged under 18, and then also to confirm their willingness and capability to participate in virtual meetings on set dates, so the dates we set in advance. And as a result of this, we received 44 applications, and we wanted 14 members for our young persons panel. So we shortlisted based on previous experience and motivations for joining the panel, and we tried to balance it by gender and location, as we wanted to achieve as far as possible UK-wide representation. So in the end, we had 14 members from across the UK. We had 4 male and 11 female, so we did receive a lot more applications from female applicants. And we had quite a good spread across the age ranges. So between 14 and 18, we had sort of 2 or 3 of each age range. And then for the meetings, or the panel meeting itself. So prior to the panel meeting, we provided a brief outlining all the information and held a virtual introductory meeting to explain the process. We, young person panel members, were able to access the applications through the PPI extranet. So this is a secure platform, and we asked them not to download anything if at all possible. The panel meeting was virtual and it was held in advance of the expert review panel. And so the young persons panel meeting ran exactly like a normal MRC board or panel meeting, where we assigned introducers. The panel members were assigned as introducers for specific applications. So they would introduce the applications and their assessment. There'd be a group discussion with everybody, and then they would go to private online scoring. So the only difference between a normal panel meeting is that a standard MRC board or panel would score on a scale of 0 to 10, whereas the young persons panel is scored using a red, amber, green rating. So a red rating meaning that they had major concerns, amber that they were kind of on the fence, or green, no major concerns. So following the young persons panel meeting, MRC staff wrote up consensus panel feedback. And then 2 representatives from the young persons panel attended the expert review panel meeting to act as a third introducer, so to present the consensus feedback. And this meant that the expert review panel could then discuss this feedback amongst the other introducers' assessments before they scored the applications. So the 2 representatives that came to the expert review panel meeting were aged 18, because it took place on a weekday and they left school at that point. So that was another thing to think about. So in terms of the value of young person involvement, it went really, like the whole process went really well. It was really interesting and just really valuable experience. So the young persons panel had really insightful comments. So just a few examples here. They had some concerns around the privacy and accuracy of data that might be collected using these new tools or methods, particularly if using gamification, which is where you design a game that collects data, or if the parents were involved in the data collection process. So for example, if using a game to collect data, they thought it might be taken less seriously than a questionnaire, even though it might be more fun. People might game the game in some way, or the game might not appeal to everybody if it was, about dungeons, I don't know, something in one particular topic area, it might not appeal to everybody. Then queries about acceptability and sensitivity of different types of data or sample collection, for example, hair or weight, and the importance of particular subject areas. So just a few examples, internet safety, puberty and stress were just areas that they thought were really important to them. And then also the level of young person inclusion and the need for clear incentives. So even if a project proposed to have quite a good level of young person involvement, if there weren't any obvious incentives for young people to take part in it, they raised that as a bit of a red flag around potential feasibility. So really interesting comments, and they were really welcomed by the expert review panel. And it was interesting as the opinions of the expert review panel on feasibility and acceptability didn't always match up with the young persons panel, so that was really valuable to bring that perspective. But overall, there was quite a strong correlation between the young persons panel and the expert review panel in terms of the overall scores, so that's really interesting. So I've just got a couple of quotes from young person panel members that were involved in the process. So the first one, it was a privilege to have participated in the EHS Method School panel. It was an extremely interesting topic and process that improved my knowledge and evaluation skills. Most importantly, I felt my contributions were valued and that I was part of something that will further impact the drive to improve and understand youth mental health. As a young person, this experience gave me confidence in where we are today and where we will be in tackling such issues and supporting young people. And then the second one, I found it really interesting learning about current research proposals, especially understanding the reason for the proposal, particularly the less explored areas of adolescent research. I enjoyed being involved in the selection process for the funding of these proposals and seeing the whole process that they need to go through to be funded. Finally, I think it's important for young people to be involved in the EHS Method School to get our perspectives on the research as the projects aimed at our age group. And then a quote from the expert review panel chair. So the contributions of the young persons panel and the grant committee were excellent and made a big difference to the committee's deliberations. The comments that they made were insightful and delivered very clearly. It was a pleasure to work with them. So in summary, if you're planning to do work with young people, you can use existing young person advisory groups or organisations that work with young people. If you're setting up your own group, before anything, it's really important to discuss your plans with your legal team, safeguarding lead, data protection team and HR. But it worked really well. It does take a bit of time, especially at the start, to get everything in place to do this, but it's really important to do and really worthwhile. And I've just included a link to the MRC and ESRC joint guidance on involving children in research here, as it's a really useful resource. It's a good first place to start. And then the next steps for us are, so now that we've made the awards and processed the award letters, next steps are to let the young persons panel know about the outcomes and ask them for their feedback about the process so that we can improve it for next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamsyn. That was really useful to hear how much added value there was from actually having the children, young people's panel, but also I think the added complexity of involving children, young people in a public involvement like that. So good to hear both sides of that. And thank you all very much to those three speakers who, all of you came along, gave such wonderful presentations and really were so open about your experiences of public involvement. And I think that'll be really motivating to people who have not tried public involvement or are just taking those first steps out or thinking about it in that non-clinical context and haven't done it in that context before. Thank you again, Tamsyn, Emma and Hal. It's been really wonderful to have you speaking to us today. Thank you.